The moment I walked into the Willowbrook Country Club's annual charity gala, I could feel the stares. Not the kind of stares you get when you're admired or respected. These were the stares you get when you're a piece of furniture that doesn't match the decor. The crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors and mahogany walls, creating an atmosphere of old money and older prejudices. Richard Pemberton, the club president, whispered something to security that made my blood run cold. That man doesn't belong here with people like us. I'm David Chen, and I've spent 40 years building what most people would call an empire. Not the flashy kind that gets written about in Forbes or plastered across business magazines, but the quiet kind that actually matters. The kind where you own the ground people walk on, the roofs over their heads, and the businesses that fund their comfortable lives. The kind where your signature appears on documents that control entire neighborhoods, even though your name never appears in the society pages. But looking at me that night, in my simple black suit from Men's Warehouse and my $20 tie, nobody would have guessed I was worth more than everyone in that room combined. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood there, champagne flute in hand, watching these people network and posture in their designer gowns and custom tuxedos. I'd been trying to join this club for 3 years, not because I needed their validation, but because my late wife Margaret had always dreamed of being part of their community. She'd grown up poor in rural Kentucky, the daughter of a coal miner who died of black lung when she was 12. The idea of belonging somewhere elegant, somewhere refined, had meant everything to her. After she passed from cancer 2 years ago, joining Willowbrook felt like honoring her memory, like finally giving her the social acceptance she'd never lived to enjoy. Margaret used to tell me stories about driving past places like this when she was young, pressing her face against the car window to catch glimpses of the manicured lawns and elegant buildings. "One day, David," she'd say, her voice soft with longing, "we'll belong somewhere beautiful, somewhere people treat us like we matter, like we're worthy of respect." I'd promised her that day would come. Standing there in that ballroom, being politely humiliated in front of 100 people, I felt like I was failing her all over again. I'd submitted my application 3 times over those 3 years. Each time, they found a reason to reject me. "Membership is full," they'd say with practiced sincerity, right before accepting someone else the following week. "We need stronger community references," they'd suggest, conveniently ignoring the letters of recommendation from the mayor, 3 city council members, and the president of the Chamber of Commerce. The truth was simple and brutal. David Chen, the guy who started as a construction worker and still spoke with the slight accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, didn't fit their image of what a Willowbrook member should look like. But I had money. More money than most of them could imagine. Specifically, I had $47 million in real estate holdings throughout the tri-state area, including a controlling interest in Pemberton Holdings, the commercial real estate company that managed most of the upscale properties in our region. I'd been quietly buying up properties for decades, always through shell companies and carefully structured trusts. My lawyer, James Mitchell, had designed the whole system to be completely legal and utterly opaque. On paper, I was just David Chen, retired contractor. In reality, I controlled more real estate than any single person in the tri-state area, with holdings that stretched from downtown office buildings to suburban shopping centers to luxury residential developments. The strategy had started simple enough. Back in the 1980s, when I was still hanging drywall and installing electrical systems, I noticed how property values moved in patterns. Young professionals would move into neglected neighborhoods, driving up demand. Zoning changes would transform industrial areas into mixed-use developments. Highway expansions would make formerly remote locations suddenly valuable. While other construction workers spent their paychecks on trucks and boats, I spent mine on small properties in areas I thought would appreciate. A duplex here, a small commercial building there, always buying below market value from motivated sellers. By the 1990s, I'd learned to think bigger. Instead of individual properties, I started acquiring entire blocks, whole neighborhoods, strategic parcels that would become valuable when the city grew around them. I established relationships with bankers who understood long-term vision, lawyers who could structure complex deals, and accountants who could minimize tax exposure while maximizing investment returns. Every property purchase was part of a larger plan, a chess game played across decades. The charity gala was supposed to be open to major donors. I'd written a check for $50,000 to their children's hospital fund, more than most members contributed in 5 years combined. My invitation was legitimate, purchased fair and square. But the moment I walked through those mahogany doors, past the portrait gallery of founding members who all looked remarkably similar, I knew I'd made a mistake. The conversations didn't just pause when I entered, they stopped completely. Eyes followed me as I moved through the room, and I could practically hear the whispered questions. Who is he? How did he get in here? Who thought this was appropriate? "Excuse me, sir?" A security guard approached me near the champagne fountain, his tone polite but firm. He was young, probably in his 20s, with the kind of athletic build that suggested military or police background. "I'm going to need to see your invitation." I handed it over with a smile, the same patient smile I'd perfected over 40 years of dealing with people who assumed I didn't belong. He studied the elegant cardstock like he was examining a counterfeit bill, turning it over, checking the watermark, even holding it up to the light. Then he spoke into his radio, using codes I couldn't quite catch. Within minutes, Richard Pemberton himself appeared, materializing from the crowd with the smooth efficiency of a man accustomed to handling unpleasant situations. His silver hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place despite the humid evening. His tuxedo probably cost more than most people's cars, custom-tailored to accommodate his expanding waistline while still projecting an image of success and authority. Everything about him screamed old money, from his gold cufflinks to his handmade Italian shoes. "Mr. Chen," he said, not bothering to extend his hand. His voice carried the careful modulation of someone who'd attended expensive schools and learned to speak with authority. "I think there's been some confusion about tonight's event." "No confusion," I replied calmly, maintaining the same even tone I'd used in thousands of business negotiations. "I donated $50,000 to the hospital fund. My invitation is valid." Pemberton's wife, Patricia, glided up beside him like a swan approaching a piece of bread floating in a pond. Her diamonds caught the light from the chandeliers, creating small rainbows that danced across her décolletage. Her dress was clearly designer, probably cost more than most people made in a month. She had the kind of blonde hair that required weekly maintenance and the kind of smooth skin that spoke of expensive dermatological procedures. "Richard, darling," she said, her voice carrying the slight drawl of someone who'd attended finishing school, "perhaps Mr. Chen would be more comfortable at one of the community fundraisers. This is a rather exclusive gathering." The conversation was happening at normal volume, but I could see other guests turning to watch, drawn by the same instinct that makes people slow down to stare at traffic accidents. Men in $1,000 tuxedos abandoned their conversations about golf handicaps and stock portfolios. Women dripping in jewelry that cost more than houses paused their discussions of charity committees and vacation homes, all of them staring at the man who clearly didn't belong, the interloper who'd somehow slipped past their carefully constructed barriers. "I understand your confusion," Pemberton said, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearby guests to hear every word. "But this event is for established members of our community, people who share our values, our background, our understanding of how things work here." Margaret's voice echoed in my memory, as clear as if she were standing beside me. "One day, David, we'll belong somewhere beautiful. Somewhere people treat us like we matter." I'd promised her that day would come. Standing there, being politely humiliated in front of 100 people who'd never worked a day of manual labor in their lives, I felt like I was failing her all over again. "I see," I said quietly, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "And what background would that be?" Patricia Pemberton laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a storm, delicate and musical, but somehow menacing. "Oh, Mr. Chen, surely you understand. This is about breeding, about family history, about the kind of education and refinement that can't be purchased." The word "purchased" hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. Around us, conversations had stopped completely. I could feel the weight of their collective judgment, their shared assumption that David Chen, with his working-class background and immigrant parents, was trying to buy his way into their world. They saw my $50,000 donation not as generosity but as desperation, an attempt to purchase acceptance that couldn't be earned through money alone. "We have standards here," Pemberton continued, warming to his theme with the confidence of a man who'd never been challenged. "Membership isn't just about writing a check. It's about being the right kind of person, contributing to society in meaningful ways, understanding your place in the community hierarchy, my place." In their minds, my place was installing their toilets, not sitting at their tables. My place was in the service entrance, not the main ballroom. My place was taking their orders, not joining their conversations about wine vintages and European vacations. "Of course," I said, maintaining my composure with the same discipline I'd learned during 40 years of dealing with difficult customers and condescending supervisors. "I wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable." "Exactly." Patricia clapped her hands together with genuine delight, as if I'd finally understood a complex lesson she'd been trying to teach a slow child. "I'm so glad you understand. There are plenty of perfectly nice clubs for people in your situation. The city has several community centers that might be more appropriate for someone with your background." The security guard was back, hovering just close enough to make his purpose clear without being explicitly threatening. Other guests had formed a loose semicircle around us, watching the drama unfold like it was dinner theater designed for their entertainment. I could see a few sympathetic faces in the crowd, people who looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but no one spoke up. No one wanted to risk their own standing by defending the outsider. "Well," Pemberton said, checking his Rolex with the casual gesture of a man accustomed to controlling other people's time, "I think we've sorted this out nicely. Mr. Chen, thank you for your generous donation to the hospital fund. I'm sure the children will appreciate it, even if you won't be able to enjoy the festivities yourself." He turned away, dismissing me like a waiter who'd overstayed his welcome at the table. But before he could take more than 2 steps, I spoke up. "Mr. Pemberton," I said, my voice carrying across the now silent ballroom with the clarity of someone who'd learned to project authority even when others tried to diminish it. He turned back, clearly annoyed at having his dramatic exit interrupted. "Yes? Before I go, I have a question." The crowd leaned in slightly, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. "How's business at Pemberton Holdings?" For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. His practiced confidence wavered for just a moment. "I beg your pardon?" Your commercial real estate company. I was reading in the business section that you've been having some challenges with property acquisitions lately. Some new competitor buying up prime locations before you can close deals. His face darkened, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composure. Our business affairs are hardly your concern, Mr. Chen. Of course not, I agreed with a slight nod. I was just curious. As someone who's worked in construction for 40 years, I've always been interested in the real estate market. The way properties change hands, the way ownership can shift without people even knowing it's happening. I paused, letting my words sink in while the crowd around us grew larger and more attentive. It must be frustrating when someone outbids you on a property you really wanted, especially when you can't figure out who's doing it. Pemberton's jaw tightened, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. If you're quite finished with whatever point you're trying to make. Just one more thing, I said, reaching into my jacket pocket with deliberate slowness. I wanted to give you this before I left. I pulled out a simple white envelope, the kind used for business correspondence, and handed it to him. He took it reluctantly, his eyes never leaving my face. What is this? Just a little gift, I said with the same calm tone I'd maintained throughout this entire humiliation. Something to remember tonight by... He opened the envelope right there, in front of everyone, his fingers trembling slightly as he unfolded the document inside. It was a simple piece of paper, but the words on it would change everything. His eyes scanned it once, then twice, then a third time. The color drained from his face like water from a broken dam. "This can't be right," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is it, darling?" Patricia peered over his shoulder, her curiosity overcoming her breeding. When she saw the document, her champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor in a spray of crystal and expensive French champagne. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced to the room, my voice calm and steady, carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom. "I want to thank you all for a truly enlightening evening. You've taught me something valuable about the difference between class and money, about the difference between being wealthy and being rich." I walked toward the exit, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor, but stopped just before reaching the ornate wooden doors. "Oh, and Mr. Pemberton? That property deed you're holding? It's for the building that houses Pemberton Holdings. As of this afternoon, I'm your new landlord. Your lease expires at the end of the month." The silence in that ballroom was deafening. I could practically hear their minds racing, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The working-class interloper they'd just humiliated apparently had enough money to buy their president's office building out from under him. But that was just the beginning. As I walked out into the cool night air, I pulled out my phone and made a call that would change everything. "James? It's David. Remember that conversation we had about the Willowbrook properties?" "Yes, all of them. I think it's time to accelerate our timeline." My lawyer's voice was cautious. "David, are you sure about this? Once we start this process, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." "What happened tonight?" I looked back at the country club, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness, filled with people who'd just learned that their world was far more fragile than they'd imagined. "They reminded me who I really am, James. And more importantly, they reminded me who they really are." "All right. I'll start the paperwork first thing in the morning." "But David, this is going to affect a lot of people. Are you prepared for the consequences?" I thought about Margaret, about the dreams she'd never lived to see fulfilled, About 40 years of being judged by my accent, my background, my appearance, about every time someone had looked at me and decided I wasn't worth their respect. The consequences started 40 years ago, James. I'm just finishing what other people began. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook, past the manicured lawns and expensive cars, past the shops and offices and homes that bore other people's names but answered to my bank account, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not satisfaction exactly, and certainly not happiness, but a sense of rightness, of justice, finally having its day. Tomorrow, these people would learn what real power looked like. And for the first time in my life, it wouldn't be wearing a $1,000 tuxedo. The next morning would bring phone calls, panic, and the kind of reckoning that comes when people discover that the man they'd dismissed as irrelevant actually controlled their entire world. But tonight, I went home to my modest house, sat in my 20-year-old recliner, and looked at Margaret's picture on the mantel. "We made it, sweetheart," I whispered to her photograph. "We finally made it to their country club. And tomorrow, we're going to make it ours." The first call came at 6:47 a.m. Richard Pemberton's voice was strained, desperate in a way that would have been unthinkable just 12 hours earlier. The confident club president who'd dismissed me so casually now sounded like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. "Mr. Chen? This is Richard Pemberton. I think we need to talk." I was sitting in my home office, sipping coffee from the same ceramic mug I'd used for 15 years, watching the sunrise paint the city skyline in shades of gold and amber. Through my floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Willowbrook Country Club in the distance, its manicured grounds and pristine buildings looking deceptively peaceful in the early morning light. From this distance, you couldn't see the panic that was surely beginning to spread through their membership. "Good morning, Mr. Pemberton," I said calmly, setting down my coffee and leaning back in my chair. "You're up early." "Mr. Chen, I've been doing some research since last night. I think there may have been some misunderstandings about your situation." Misunderstandings. That was Rich. As if humiliating me in front of 100 people was just a simple miscommunication that could be cleared up with a phone call. "Research?" I asked, genuinely curious about what he'd discovered. "What kind of research?" "Well, it seems your real estate holdings are more extensive than we realized. James Mitchell's law firm represents several of the shell companies that own properties in our area. When I called him this morning—" "You called my lawyer at 6 in the morning?" There was a pause, and I could hear the embarrassment in his voice. "Mr. Chen, we need to discuss this situation. Perhaps we could meet for breakfast. I'm sure we can work out some kind of arrangement regarding the Pemberton Holdings lease." I set my coffee cup down and walked to the window. From here, I could see the office building that housed his company, one of 17 properties I'd acquired in the Willowbrook area over the past 8 years. The Pemberton Holdings lease wasn't just expiring. I'd structured it specifically so I could terminate it with 30 days' notice for any reason. My lawyers had been very thorough about including those clauses. "I appreciate the call, Mr. Pemberton, but I'm quite busy this morning. I have several meetings with property managers about some changes I'm implementing." "Changes?" His voice cracked slightly on the word. "Nothing that concerns you directly, just some adjustments to my portfolio. Lease reviews, tenant evaluations, that sort of thing. Standard business practices when you're reassessing your investments." The second call came 20 minutes later, just as I was reviewing the files James had prepared for me. Patricia Pemberton, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage, sounding nothing like the refined socialite who'd suggested I belonged at a community center. "How dare you?" she hissed into the phone, her careful breeding abandoned in favor of raw fury. "You think you can just buy your way into our world?" You think money gives you the right to threaten respectable people. Mrs. Pemberton, I said, genuinely confused by her accusation, I haven't threatened anyone. I simply conducted some legitimate business transactions. Don't play games with me. Do you have any idea who we are, the connections we have, the influence we wield in this community? I pulled up a file on my computer, scanning the list of properties and their current tenants. I'm beginning to get a sense of it, I replied. Tell me, how is your boutique doing? Willowbrook Treasures, isn't it? Such a lovely little shop in the Meridian Plaza. The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know. She'd just realized that her boutique was located in one of my buildings, too. The Meridian Plaza was one of my first major acquisitions in the area, purchased 15 years ago when it was struggling to maintain occupancy. I'd invested heavily in renovations, upgraded the facilities, and carefully selected tenants who would create a synergistic shopping environment. "We can fight you," she said finally, her voice trembling. "We have resources. We have friends in high places. We have lawyers who can tie you up in court for years." "I'm sure you do. And I hope they'll still be friends when they discover the full extent of your husband's financial situation. Did you know that Pemberton Holdings has been operating on credit for the past 18 months? That your husband's been borrowing against future lease revenues to maintain cash flow?" Another silence. Apparently, she hadn't known that. By 9 a.m., my phone was ringing constantly. James Mitchell had spent the morning fielding calls from attorneys, real estate agents, and several very worried Willowbrook residents who'd suddenly realized their landlord wasn't who they thought he was. His usually calm demeanor was strained when he called me back. "David," James said, his voice tight with stress, "you've stirred up quite the hornet's nest. Half the professional class in Willowbrook is trying to figure out who David Chen really is and why he owns so much of their neighborhood. And what are they finding out? That you're a ghost. Your name appears on almost nothing directly. Every property is held through trusts, LLCS, or corporations with names like Meridian Holdings and Sunset Properties. But when they dig deeper, when they follow the paper trail through multiple layers of corporate structures, it all leads back to you. This had been the plan from the beginning. Not revenge. I hadn't known I'd need revenge back then. But privacy. The kind of wealthy privacy that lets you see how people really behave when they think you can't touch them. The kind of anonymity that allows you to move through the world without the constant scrutiny that comes with visible wealth. "I've been getting calls all morning," James continued. "The Hendersons want to know if their lease is secure. The Blackwoods are panicking about their office space. Dr. Williams just discovered that you own the building where he has his medical practice. And that's just the beginning. Dr. Williams." I remembered him from last night, standing near the bar with his wife, both of them watching my humiliation with the same fascination people show when passing a car accident. He'd been one of the ones laughing when Patricia Pemberton suggested I'd be more comfortable at a community center. "What about the country club itself?" "That's where it gets really interesting," James said, and I could hear the satisfaction creeping into his voice. "The club doesn't own their property. They have a long-term lease with something called Greenwood Management Company, which is a subsidiary of Meridian Holdings, which is owned by Sunset Properties, which is controlled by the David Chen Trust." I sat down heavily in my chair, the full implications finally hitting me. "I own the country club." "You own the land it sits on? The clubhouse, the golf course, the tennis courts, the swimming pool, the parking lot, and the maintenance facilities. The lease runs for another 15 years, but there's a clause that allows for termination if the property is needed for alternative development purposes. My hands were shaking as I absorbed this information. I owned the country club, the same country club that had rejected my membership 3 times, the same club where Richard Pemberton had told security I didn't belong with people like them, the same place where I'd been humiliated in front of 100 people who thought they were better than me. "James," I said slowly, "I want you to pull every lease, every contract, every agreement we have with anyone who was at that gala last night. David, that's going to be a lot of people. The country club membership overlaps significantly with your tenant base." "I don't care. I want to know exactly how many of those people depend on my properties for their livelihoods." The third wave of calls started around noon. These weren't from the Pembertons or their immediate circle. These were from people who were just beginning to understand how deep my ownership ran through their community, how extensively their comfortable lives depended on the man they'd dismissed as unworthy. "Mr. Chen, this is Susan Martinez from Martinez and Associates CPA. We handle the books for several businesses in the Willowbrook area. I'm calling because we've discovered some irregularities in our lease agreements." "What kind of irregularities, Ms. Martinez?" "Well, it appears that several of our clients' leases are held by companies that are connected to your holdings, and some of these leases have clauses that allow for immediate termination under certain circumstances." "Such as?" "Breach of community standards, behavior detrimental to property values, actions that create a hostile environment for other tenants or community members. I'd forgotten about those clauses. My lawyer had suggested them years ago as a way to maintain property values and ensure a positive environment for all tenants. If a tenant was causing problems, running a disruptive business, harassing other tenants, damaging the community reputation, I could remove them quickly without going through lengthy legal proceedings. And your clients are concerned because several of them were present at the country club event last night, and they're worried that their treatment of you might be construed as community standards violations." By 2 p.m., I had received 17 more calls from various business owners, professionals, and residents of Willowbrook, all of them suddenly very interested in being respectful, accommodating, and apologetic, all of them suddenly realizing that the man they'd collectively dismissed might have more power over their lives than they'd ever imagined. The fourth call was the one I'd been waiting for. Dr. Gerald Whitfield, the club's membership committee chairman. The man who'd personally rejected my application 3 times, always with polite regret and carefully crafted excuses. "Mr. Chen," his voice was barely above a whisper, "I think we should meet." "Should we?" "Why is that, Dr. Whitfield?" "I believe there may have been some errors in our previous membership evaluations, some oversights in our review process that need to be corrected." "Errors? We may have underestimated your contributions to the community, your business success, your suitability for membership in our organization." I looked out at the city again, at the buildings and businesses and homes that bore other people's names but answered to my bank account. 40 years of work, 40 years of being polite, being patient, being invisible. 40 years of letting people like Gerald Whitfield judge my worth based on my accent and my background while I quietly bought the ground they walked on. "Dr. Whitfield, I appreciate the call, but I'm not sure membership is what I'm interested in anymore." "Mr. Chen, please, let's be reasonable. You're a successful businessman. We're a prestigious organization. Surely we can find a way to work together that benefits everyone." "Benefits everyone?" "Of course. You get the social recognition you've been seeking. We get a member with significant resources who can contribute to our various initiatives. And in exchange? In exchange, you continue to be the discreet, successful businessman you've always been. You don't make waves. You don't cause problems for people who may have misjudged the situation last night." I almost laughed. He was trying to buy my silence, offering me membership in exchange for pretending that their behavior was acceptable, for letting them save face while they quietly welcomed me into their circle. "Dr. Whitfield, I need to ask you something. Last night, when Richard Pemberton told security I didn't belong with people like them, where were you?" Silence. "When Patricia Pemberton suggested I'd be more comfortable at a community center, where were you?" "Mr. Chen, when they were humiliating me in front of 100 people, treating me like I was some kind of interloper who'd snuck into their party, where exactly were you?" The situation was complicated. Social dynamics can be delicate. Sometimes it's better to let these things resolve themselves naturally rather than escalating them unnecessarily. "I see. And now that you know I can destroy every one of your members financially, suddenly the social dynamics are different. Mr. Chen, please, let's not escalate this situation beyond what it needs to be. Surely we can find a reasonable solution that works for everyone." But it was already too late for that, because while Dr. Whitfield was calling to offer me membership, my property managers were calling to inform me about the lease reviews I'd ordered that morning, and the results were even more extensive than I'd imagined. James called back at 3 p.m. with the final tally, his voice filled with amazement. "David, I've never seen anything like this. You don't just own some buildings in Willowbrook. You own the foundation of their entire social structure." He started reading from his notes, and with each property he listed, I felt the true scope of my position becoming clear. "The country club property, yours. The Pemberton Holdings office building, yours. The medical complex where 6 board members have their practices, yours. The shopping plaza where their wives have their boutiques, yours. The apartment complex where the club's younger members live, yours. Even the parking garage they use for overflow during events, yours." I felt a strange calm settling over me. For 40 years, I'd been building this empire one property at a time, always thinking about long-term value, strategic locations, community stability. I'd never realized I was also building the ultimate leverage over the people who'd spent those same 40 years treating me as invisible. "But here's the really interesting part," James continued. "They're not just panicking about their leases. They're realizing that their entire social hierarchy is built on land they don't own, in buildings controlled by the man they just publicly humiliated." The calls continued throughout the afternoon, business owners begging for lease renewals, professionals offering partnerships, social leaders suddenly discovering my valuable contributions to the community. All of them trying to undo in a few hours what had taken them years to build, a wall of exclusion that had kept people like me on the outside. But the most telling call came at 4:45 p.m., just 15 minutes before the close of business. It was from Margaret's oncologist, Dr. Rebecca Nash, a woman who'd treated my wife with compassion and dignity during her final months. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice warm with genuine concern, "I heard about what happened at the club last night. I wanted you to know that not everyone in this community shares those attitudes." "Thank you, Dr. Nash. That means more than you know. I also wanted you to know that if you decide to make changes to the medical complex lease, I hope you'll consider the impact on patient care. Many of us chose our locations specifically to serve this community." It was the first call I'd received that day where someone had thought about the consequences for others, not just for themselves. The first time someone had shown the kind of character Margaret would have respected. "Dr. Nash, your lease is secure. You treated my wife with dignity when she was dying. You treated me with respect when other people saw only a grieving immigrant. You'll never have to worry about your lease as long as I own that building. Thank you, Mr. Chen. And I'm sorry about what happened last night. You deserved better. As the sun set over Willowbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I sat in my office, surrounded by files and phone messages, holding more power over my community than I'd ever imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring the real reckoning, when the full scope of the changes would become clear. The emergency board meeting was called for 4 p.m. the next day. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. I owned the building where they were meeting, and James had ensured that the lease agreement included certain monitoring provisions for security purposes. At 4:30, my phone rang. It was James Mitchell, calling from his car in the country club parking lot. "David, you need to hear this. I just left the Willowbrook Country Club emergency session. It's absolute chaos in there. Tell me." They've spent the last 3 hours trying to figure out exactly how much of their world you control. The answer is almost all of it. I've never seen grown men and women so completely terrified. He started reading from his notes, his voice filled with a mixture of professional admiration and personal satisfaction. "The country club property, yours. The Pemberton Holdings office building, yours. The medical complex where 6 board members have their practices, yours. The shopping plaza where their wives have their boutiques, yours. The apartment complex where the club's younger members live, yours. Even the parking garage they use for overflow during events, yours." I felt that strange calm settling over me again. For 40 years, I'd been building this empire one property at a time, always thinking about long-term value, strategic locations, community stability. I'd never realized I was also building the ultimate leverage over the people who'd spent those same 40 years treating me as invisible. "But here's the really interesting part," James continued. "They're not just panicking about their leases. They're realizing that their entire social hierarchy is built on land they don't own, in buildings controlled by the man they just publicly humiliated. Dr. Williams discovered that you own not just his medical building, but also the parking structure his patients use. Mrs. Henderson found out that you control the lease on her art gallery and the adjacent restaurant where she hosts her opening receptions. The scope was staggering. Over 4 decades of careful investment, I'd woven myself into the fabric of their community so thoroughly that removing me would unravel everything they'd built. And they were just beginning to understand the implications. Patricia Pemberton actually started crying during the meeting," James said, his voice carrying a note of incredulity. "She kept saying, 'He's nobody. He's just a construction worker. How can he own everything?' Richard had to physically restrain her from throwing things. At 5 p.m., my doorbell rang. Through the security camera, I could see Richard Pemberton standing alone on my doorstep, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 2 days. His usually perfect silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, his confident bearing replaced by the posture of a man who'd discovered that his world was far more fragile than he'd ever imagined. I opened the door and gestured for him to come in. He stepped into my modest living room, modest by choice, not necessity, and looked around like he was trying to reconcile my simple furniture with the financial power he'd just discovered. The same brown leather recliner I'd bought 20 years ago, the same oak coffee table Margaret had picked out at a furniture store closing sale, the same family photos in inexpensive frames from the local drugstore. "Mr. Chen," he began, his voice hoarse from hours of desperate phone calls, "I owe you an apology. Do you? Last night, the way we treated you, it was inexcusable. We made assumptions based on appearances, and we were completely wrong." I sat down in my recliner, the same chair where Margaret and I had spent countless evenings planning our future, discussing our dreams, sharing our hopes for the day when we'd finally belong somewhere that mattered. Pemberton remained standing, shifting his weight from foot to foot, like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. "What assumptions did you make, Mr. Pemberton?" "We thought—" He swallowed hard, the words clearly difficult for him to speak. "We thought you were someone trying to buy their way into a world where they didn't belong. And now? Now we realize you already own that world." I nodded slowly, studying his face. "So, your apology isn't because you think what you did was wrong. It's because you discovered I have the power to hurt you. Mr. Chen, please, answer the question, Richard. If I were still just David Chen, the retired construction worker, would you be here apologizing?" The silence stretched between us for nearly a minute. I could see him struggling, weighing honesty against self-preservation, trying to find words that would salvage his position without admitting the full extent of his prejudice. I want to believe I would," he said finally. "But you don't know." "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know." That honesty, at least, was something. More than I'd expected from a man who'd built his reputation on careful words and political maneuvering. "Richard, let me tell you a story," I said, settling back in my chair. 40 years ago, I came to this country with nothing but a suitcase and a head full of dreams. My parents worked double shifts in textile factories, saved every penny so I could go to college. They believed that education was the key to acceptance, that if I could just get the right degrees, speak the right way, dress the right way, people would judge me by my character instead of my appearance. Pemberton sat down uninvited on my couch, leaning forward with the intensity of a man trying to understand how his world had turned upside down in less than 48 hours. "I studied engineering at State University, graduated summa cum laude, had recommendations from professors who called me the most promising student they'd ever taught. But when I went looking for work, companies wouldn't hire me because my English had an accent, because my name was different, because I didn't have the right connections or the right background." I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawns and expensive houses of Willowbrook, the community that had excluded me for so long while unknowingly depending on my investment and ownership. So I took a job in construction. Manual labor, hanging drywall, installing electrical systems, building the offices and homes and shopping centers where successful people worked and lived and played. And while I was doing that work, while I was invisible to everyone around me, I was also learning about property values, about zoning laws, about how money really moves through a community. I turned back to face him. Every property I bought because I understood its value. Not just its current value, but its potential value. I never bought anything as revenge or to hurt anyone. I bought things because they were good investments that would provide security for my family and contribute to the community's growth. I understand that, Mr. Chen. Your business acumen is clearly exceptional. But here's what you don't understand, Richard. Last night, when you had me escorted out of that club, when you told everyone I didn't belong with people like you weren't just insulting me. You were insulting every immigrant, every working-class person, every human being who's ever been judged by their appearance instead of their accomplishments. I moved closer to where he sat, wanting him to see the emotion in my eyes. And now you want to make it right. Not because you've learned anything about respect or dignity, but because you're afraid of what I might do with the power you've just discovered I have. What are you going to do? The question I'd been asking myself since that humiliating moment in the ballroom. What was I going to do with this power? How do you respond to a lifetime of exclusion when you suddenly discover you hold all the cards? I'm going to give you all a choice, I said finally. The same choice you gave me last night. I don't understand. You told me I had two options: accept that I didn't belong or leave. Now I'm telling you the same thing. You can accept that your behavior last night was unacceptable and make real changes, or you can find somewhere else to conduct your business. What kind of changes? The country club is going to become genuinely inclusive. Not just wealthy people who look and sound like you, but successful people from all backgrounds. The membership fees are going to be reduced so that teachers and firefighters and small business owners can afford to join. And there's going to be a scholarship program for young people who want to learn golf but can't afford lessons. Pemberton's face went white. You're talking about completely changing the character of the club. I'm talking about giving it character for the first time. The members will never accept that. Then they can find another club, one that doesn't sit on my land. Over the next hour, I laid out my terms in detail. Not just for the country club, but for all of my properties in the Willowbrook area. Businesses that wanted to renew their leases would need to demonstrate inclusive hiring practices and community engagement. Residential tenants would be selected based on their ability to pay and their character, without regard to their background, accent, or social connections. The shopping plaza would reserve spaces for minority-owned businesses at reduced rates, and there would be a mentorship program pairing established business owners with new entrepreneurs. You're asking me to go back to the board with demands that will fundamentally change our entire community, Pemberton said, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was hearing. I'm not asking you anything, Richard. I'm telling you what's going to happen. And if we refuse? I pulled out my phone and showed him a text message from my property management company. As of this afternoon, I've initiated lease reviews for 127 properties in the Willowbrook area. Every single one of your board members, their businesses, their families, their social circle, they're all affected. His hands were shaking as he read the message. The scope was even larger than he'd imagined. Not just the country club members, but their extended network of family and business associates, lawyers who handled their legal work, accountants who managed their books, contractors who maintained their properties, retailers who sold them luxury goods. You can't just evict everyone, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I can't evict anyone without cause. But I can choose not to renew leases when they expire. I can decide that certain behaviors create a hostile environment for other tenants. I can determine that some business practices are inconsistent with community standards. This is extortion. No, Richard. This is consequences. For 40 years, you and people like you have used your social power to exclude, to diminish, to create artificial barriers that serve no purpose except to make you feel superior. Now you're learning what it feels like when someone else holds the power to include or exclude you. The meeting with the full board happened 3 days later. All 15 members crammed into the conference room at Pemberton Holdings. The same building I now owned, a fact that wasn't lost on anyone present. The irony was perfect. They were meeting to discuss my ultimatum in a building I could evict them from at any time. They'd spent those 3 days frantically trying to find alternatives, new office spaces, new retail locations, new homes in other exclusive communities. What they'd discovered was that David Chen's property holdings extended well beyond Willowbrook. I owned commercial buildings in 6 different suburbs, residential properties in a dozen neighborhoods, and had financial interests in development projects across the entire metropolitan area. Mr. Chen, Dr. Whitfield began, his voice formal and strained, we've reviewed your proposals for restructuring the club and community standards, and We have some concerns about the practicality of implementing such sweeping changes so quickly. I looked around the table at their faces. These were successful, educated, influential people. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, community leaders. A week ago, they'd collectively decided that David Chen wasn't worthy to sit at their table. Now they were learning what it felt like to have their futures decided by someone they'd dismissed as irrelevant. "Let me be very clear about something," I said, my voice calm but firm. "These aren't proposals. These are the new terms of tenancy for my properties. You can accept them and stay, or reject them and leave, but you can't negotiate them away." Patricia Pemberton, who'd remained silent until now, finally spoke up. Her voice was strained, lacking the confident authority she'd displayed at the gala. "Mr. Chen, surely you understand that what you're asking will destroy everything we've built here. The exclusivity, the standards, the culture of our community." "Mrs. Pemberton, tell me about the culture of your community." "Well, we're people who've worked hard, who've achieved success, who value excellence and refinement, who decide that success is only legitimate if it looks like yours. That's not fair, isn't it? Last week, you told me that membership wasn't about writing a check. It was about breeding, about family history, about education and refinement that couldn't be purchased. Tell me, what family history did your husband have when he inherited his father's failing real estate company and turned it around? What breeding did Dr. Whitfield demonstrate when he was the first person in his family to attend college?" Silence around the table. I'd done my research on each of them, learned their stories, understood their backgrounds. Most of them came from modest beginnings, had worked their way up through determination and opportunity. But somehow they'd convinced themselves that their struggles were noble, while other people's struggles were somehow less worthy. Every single person in this room has a story of working hard and overcoming obstacles to achieve success, I continued. But somehow you've convinced yourselves that your journey was legitimate while mine was not. That your accent was charming while mine was foreign. That your background was colorful while mine was unsuitable. Dr. Williams cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Chen, we're willing to consider some changes. Perhaps we could expand membership criteria gradually, review our policies over time." "No." "I'm sorry?" "No gradual changes, no policy reviews, no committees to study the feasibility of treating people with respect." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the golf course. In the distance, I could see the maintenance crew preparing the greens for tomorrow's players. Most of them were men who looked like me, men with accents and immigrant backgrounds, men who'd never been inside the clubhouse except to work. Tomorrow morning, the club will announce its new inclusive membership policies. Applications will be accepted from anyone who meets the basic requirements: good character, ability to pay the new reduced fees, and commitment to treating all members with respect, regardless of their background. And if we refuse, then tomorrow morning, you'll also receive termination notices for your leases. All of you. Every business, every office, every retail space, every residential property. The room erupted, voices raised, chairs pushed back, threats and pleading and desperate negotiations all happening at once. Through it all, I remained calm, watching the maintenance crew work on the golf course that would soon welcome new kinds of members. "How many people are you willing to destroy over this?" Richard Pemberton shouted over the chaos. "I'm not destroying anyone, Richard. I'm giving you the same choice you gave me: adapt or leave. You can't possibly evict everyone, the legal challenges alone." "James," I called out. My lawyer, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've spent the last 3 days reviewing every lease, Every contract, every agreement, James said, his voice cutting through the noise. Mr. Chen's position is legally unassailable. Every property has appropriate termination clauses. Moreover, several tenants have already violated community standards provisions through their public conduct at the gala. The room fell silent again. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't a bluff or a negotiation. This was a reckoning 40 years in the making. "What happens to our families?" Susan Martinez asked quietly, her voice barely audible. "Our employees? The people who depend on our businesses?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been thinking about since this all began. I hadn't wanted to hurt innocent people, only to force accountability from those who'd created and maintained the barriers. Anyone who's been treating people with respect, who's been conducting their business with integrity, who hasn't been part of the exclusionary culture, they'll be fine. Their leases will be renewed under favorable terms. In fact, they'll probably find their situations improved when the artificial barriers come down. And the rest of us? The rest of you will learn what it feels like to be judged by your character instead of your connections. Over the following weeks, the changes rippled through Willowbrook like an earthquake. Some people left immediately, selling their businesses and moving to other communities where their old attitudes would be more welcome. Others stayed and grudgingly accepted the new reality, discovering that treating people with respect wasn't as difficult as they'd imagined. The country club's membership doubled within 6 months. Teachers, firefighters, small business owners, and immigrants like myself joined alongside the doctors and lawyers who remained. The golf course that had once been a symbol of exclusivity became a place where my neighbor the postal worker could play 18 holes with the bank president. Not everyone was happy with the changes. Patricia Pemberton moved to another state, declaring that Willowbrook had lost its standards. Several board members found new offices in other towns, grumbling about reverse discrimination and property rights. But their departures created opportunities for others who brought fresh perspectives and genuine commitment to community building. Something beautiful happened, too. The community became more vibrant, more diverse, more genuinely successful. Local businesses thrived when they could hire from a broader talent pool. The schools improved when parents from different backgrounds brought different strengths and perspectives. The social events became more interesting when the guest lists weren't limited to people who all looked and sounded the same. Richard Pemberton stayed. He struggled at first, clearly uncomfortable with the new dynamics, but gradually seemed to adapt. His real estate company actually became more profitable when it started serving clients it had previously ignored. He learned to work with contractors and clients from diverse backgrounds and discovered that competence had nothing to do with accent or appearance. 6 months after that humiliating night at the gala, I received an invitation to speak at the country club's annual charity dinner. This time, the cause was a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, kids whose parents, like mine, were working multiple jobs to give their children better opportunities. I stood at the same podium where Richard Pemberton had once held court, looking out at faces that represented the true diversity of our community. In the front row, I'd placed Margaret's photo, which I'd brought to honor her memory. She'd finally made it to the country club. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "a year ago, I thought the goal was to earn acceptance from people I believed were better than me. Tonight, I understand that the real goal was to create a community where acceptance doesn't have to be earned, where it's freely given to anyone willing to treat their neighbors with respect." The applause was genuine, warm, inclusive. These weren't people clapping because they had to, or because they feared the consequences of not clapping. These were people who'd learned that a community's strength comes not from who it excludes, but from who it welcomes. After the dinner, Richard Pemberton approached me. "David," he said. "We were on a first-name basis now. I owe you an apology I should have given you months ago." "You already apologized, Richard." "No, I apologized because I was afraid of what you might do. Tonight I'm apologizing because I finally understand what I did." He looked around the room at the diverse crowd of members talking and laughing together. "You didn't destroy our community. You saved it from destroying itself." As I drove home that night, I thought about power and how it's used. For 40 years, I'd been accumulating financial power while people like the Pembertons wielded social power. They'd used their power to exclude, to diminish, to create artificial hierarchies that served no purpose except to make them feel superior. I'd used my power differently, not to exclude them, but to force inclusion, not to create new hierarchies, but to tear down the old ones, not to seek revenge, but to demand justice. The Willowbrook Country Club still exists today, more successful than ever. Its membership is diverse, its events are vibrant, and its scholarship program has helped dozens of young people achieve their dreams. The community around it has thrived, proving that when you measure success by contribution rather than background, everyone benefits. And me? I finally became a member. Not because I bought my way in, and not because they were afraid to say no. I became a member because I'd helped create the kind of place where membership was about character, not connections. Margaret would have loved it. If you enjoyed watching the Willowbrook elite get their comeuppance, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories where arrogance meets its match. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you have done in my situation? Would you have revealed your identity immediately or played the long game like I did? And if you've ever been judged unfairly because of your background, your accent, or your appearance, share your story below. Every person deserves respect, regardless of where they came from or how they sound when they speak. Hit that notification bell, because tomorrow I'm sharing the story of the stepmother who told her husband's children they weren't welcome in her house until she discovered the house was actually in their names. Trust me, you won't want to miss that one. Thanks for watching Silent Vengeance, where quiet dignity meets loud justice. See you in the next story.